On the 28th of November 1786, a young man arrived in Edinburgh. With a bad hangover, it had taken him over 2 rain-soaked days to cover 60 miles on a pony he'd borrowed. He went to the old churchyard in a corner of the Canongate on the Royal Mile, and he looked among the gravestones for a burial plot. Finding no headstone, he was appalled to learn that the person he was looking for was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave. In the fading light of the kirkyard, he stood and wept before kneeling down and kissing the cold earth. The man was Robert Burns, and he'd come to pay his respects to fellow poet Robert Fergusson. Such was Burns's reverence for Fergusson that he called him by far my elder brother in the muse. In the late 18th century, Edinburgh was a magnet for the greatest thinkers and writers of the age, and Burns couldn't resist it. But he greatly admired a young poet Edinburgh had forgotten, a poet to whom he owed a huge debt. This is the story of Robert Fergusson, Scotland's unsung literary genius, a man whose work would change everything and who inspired the poet who would be remembered as our national bard. Just as Robert Burns was the great genius of Scottish rural life, Robert Fergusson was the great genius of city life. His masterpiece, Auld Reekie, captures all the bustle and glory of Edinburgh. Auld Reekie, whale o' ilka tune that Scotland kens beneath the moon, where couthie chiels at evening meet, their bizen craigs and moos to weet. Like a documentary filmmaker, the poet's eye captured Edinburgh, recording everything as it unfolded over a single day in the life of the city, starting at dawn. Now morn, with bonny purpy smiles, kisses the aircock of
St. Giles, raking their een the servant lasses, early begin their lies and clashes. Ilk tells her friend of saddest distress, that still she brooks for scowling mistress.
And so the day begins, Fergusson introducing us to the folk of Edinburgh as they go about their important business. Characters from all walks of life, taking their turn in the crowded streets, streets that set the poet's imagination ablaze. On the 5th of September 1750, Robert Fergusson was born in the Cap and Feather Clothes, an alley just off the Royal Mile. Fergusson's home has long disappeared, but he would have known Mary King's Close nearby, now buried under 2 centuries of history. Today, it's kept as it was in the 18th century, complete with its own Robert Fergusson. Hello, nice to meet you.
Hello, nice to meet you.
So you actually play Robert Fergusson?
I am. I play Robert Fergusson as a character for my job. I do tours here.
Fantastic. Let's go and have a look. So do people actually know who Robert Fergusson was?
He tends to be one of the lesser-known characters of Edinburgh's history, to be honest. People are always interested to find out more.
Ferguson's parents had arrived in bustling Edinburgh 2 years earlier from rural Aberdeenshire. The city was little more than a single street, with hundreds of narrow alleys or closes leading off like a series of warrens. You had a population of 35,000 crammed into a wee neighbourhood of rich and poor, all the bodies of the toon stacked on top of each other in well-worn tenements. Fergusson's eye would have taken it all in.
There'd be thousands of people crammed down there. You'd have tenement blocks of flats with shops on them. You'd have market stalls on either side, even in the middle of the road.
So small vendors selling fish, selling tobacco, that sort of thing?
Yeah, exactly. They would sort of leave unsold products behind on the street, and this would start to kind of rot and fester. You'd also have household pets like pigs, for example, and all this horrible waste and filth just lying around the street, creating a kind of smell. It was said of Edinburgh you could smell it before you could see it.
Fergusson put all that into language, the sounds and smells. We find the maids emptying the chamber pots in the morning.
On stairway tub or pat in hand, the barefoot housemaids low to stand. The antron frock me ken how snell, auld reekie will at morning smell.
Then, with an inundation big as the burn that neath the Norloch Brigus, they kindly showered diners' roses to quicken and regale our noses.
But these poky, stinking streets were a thing of the past in the go-getting Scotland that emerged after the Union. It was decided to build a bigger, better city, the new town. This was to be the Athens of the North, the centre of the Scottish Enlightenment. Yet it brought a marked social divide.
As soon as they constructed the new town, the wealthiest people that had been so desperate to get away from these lower classes had just moved across to the other side and left behind what essentially became a slum.
Fergusson saw Edinburgh right on the cusp of change. His own home was demolished to make way for the new town. He walked its streets and captured the sights, sounds and smells of the old city, preserving it, whilst also greeting the modern dawn. 30 years later, Burns himself would be delighting polite society in the drawing rooms of the new town. Fergusson's father, William, was a man of some education, and he was believed to have some literary talent himself, but he was forced into a series of lowly clerking jobs just to support his young family. In Scotland especially, education was seen as a pathway out of poverty. Fergusson's family had little money, but they spent what they could on schooling. Like Burns's parents, the Fergussons tutored their children at home before sending them to local schools. But unlike Burns, Fergusson won a bursary and his education continued. In 1762, Fergusson went to the Grammar School of Dundee on a scholarship provided for the maintenance and education of poor male children. He did well and landed a place here at the University of St Andrews. Fergusson was immersed in the classics, mathematics and philosophy. So what kind of time did Fergusson have here at St Andrews?
Probably quite a wild time. He got into trouble quite a lot. He did some naughty things. He was a good singer. He prayed. He offered formal prayers in the hall in the university. And one night he seems to have put up a prayer for a friend of his that he says was on the edge of dying. But actually the guy was sitting there in the hall all the time. So the other students cracked up and he got into trouble with the university authorities.
Did he have any enemies?
Oh yes, you can tell that too. The students would deface library books and they would write abusive remarks about each other, but the abusive remarks about Robert Fergusson, written by at least one of his fellow students, go further than usual. Do you want me to read you a wee bit?
Please do.
The wonderful wonder of wonders, Robert Fergusson, is a damned eternal puppy, a stinking fairy, a reptile of the serpent kind, a snake in human form, stained with infamy and wickedness. This serpent Robert Fergusson spews a filthy froth of pustulant matter, which if it happens to light on the skin, will corrupt to a wound and spread a leprosy or the French pox. Now that is somebody who did not like him.
He did not like Robert Fergusson.
And probably that implies he was a bit of a libertine when he was here, a bit of a lad.
He was a clever and funny lad o' pairts, but he also had a deeper, reflective side. And he gave it all to his new obsession, poetry. But while most Scottish writers were polishing their English, Fergusson took delight in earlier Scots traditions.
Like Burns, he wrote in English and he wrote in neoclassical English, but like Burns, he wrote poems chiefly in the Scottish dialect. So although he'd gone to university here and been trained really to comb Scots dialect out of his English, because Scots was thought to be rough and uncouth by some of his teachers, Fergusson was a bit bolshy and he liked to be true to the grain of Scots vernacular.
What are these forms that we would associate with Fergusson? Standard Habbie?
Yes.
And there's a particular rhythm that Burns later picks up.
Yes, if you think of the stanza form that's there in Holy Willie's Prayer, that's a standard Habbie stanza form, and it's got a history that goes back to before Robert Fergusson, but it would fit in with his attraction to the distinctively Scottish, which he would have heard in various varieties. He would have heard the Doric from his parents. He'd gone to school in Edinburgh, he'd gone to school in Dundee, and then he comes to St Andrews, aged 14, where he's bound to be surrounded by other teenagers speaking Scots, but teenagers who are being taught to comb that Scots out of their writing. He doesn't. He writes these wonderfully electrically energised poems in Scots, full of quickness, vivacity, motion. He writes poems about food and drink, as Burns will do, but as Burns doesn't, he writes Auld Reekie in Scots, about the city, from the middle of the city, hailed immediately by other people in Edinburgh. Oh yeah, this is good stuff, this is about us.
When Phoebus blinks wi' warmer ray, and schools at noonday get the play,
then business, weighty business comes. The trader glowers, he doubts, he hums.
The lawyers eke to cross-repair their wigs to show and toss in air, while busy agent closely plies and all his kittle cases tries.
In May 1768, Fergusson found himself back in Edinburgh. His father had died, and his family were living in poorer quarters here at Bell's Wynd. Fergusson's aspiration of a legal or medical career were in tatters. Instead, he took work as a clerk in the commissary office, a legal copyist being paid a penny a page. It was boring, unstimulating work, but it gave him a regular income and allowed him to develop his talents. In his spare time, he sang songs, he made friends, and he wrote poetry. Poetry about Edinburgh. While Danderins sits delight to stray to Castle Hill or public way, where they nae other purpose mean than that full cause o' being seen. Let me to Arthur's seat pursue, where bonny pastures meet the view. Hi, Rona.
Hello.
Great to meet you.
You too.
So, Rona, here we are in the centre of the old town in Edinburgh. Robert Fergusson could be described as a laureate of urban life in Scottish poetry. What were Fergusson's subjects as a poet?
Well, he certainly likes to talk about people. People of all sorts. People that are of high station, low station, somewhere in between. In Auld Reekie, there are all sorts of characters that populate a day in the life in Edinburgh. So we go from, through the day, we've got schoolboys running about. We've got on Sunday ministers who change their face as well as their clays, etc. And we've got at night time prostitutes, we've got lazy chairmen, we've got thieves, we've got drunkards.
Fergusson's instinct was to satirise authority figures and laugh at people who took themselves too seriously in a way. That was something that Burns admired, wasn't it?
Yeah, that ability to prick a bubble of pretension that Burns is so good at, Fergusson is equally good at that. There's a poem that Fergusson wrote called Braid Claith, where he says that you can be whatever you like. You can be a doctor, you can get your degrees, you can be a medicine man if you've got the right suit on. And it's just that really, really satirical look at modern life, if you like, in the 18th
I mean, that's a very
century.
modern thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
To say
yeah.
that, you know, basically human beings are human beings,
Yep.
and cloth or whatever else
Yeah.
isn't going to conceal their basic humanity.
Yeah. And the 18th century is a period where they're facing quite a lot of issues that we are facing today, with bank failures, with food being too expensive.
And the cult of celebrity on the rise.
Exactly. And even people like the Macaroni who dress up in their very, very pompous outfits. So quite a lot that we can identify with, I think, in Fergusson's work.
Fergusson's job may have been dull, but he made up for it in his social life. This was the great age of tavern clubs in Edinburgh. Henley, the orator, wrote, Edinburgh was a centre of conviviality, a city of clubs and talk and good fellowship, a city of harlotry and high jinks, a city, above all, of drink. And Fergusson slotted right in. So we know that Edinburgh was a place of taverns and private members' clubs. Was Fergusson interested in that world?
Yeah, certainly. Absolutely immersed in that world. So in Edinburgh in the 18th century, we had taverns, we had inns, lots and lots of pubs, but also lots and lots of private members' clubs where you would get special membership to a private society, if you like. Fergusson was a really important and very enthusiastic member of the Cape Club.
And what was that?
Cape Club was essentially a convivial society, but it had literary elements to it too. So members would discuss books, discuss poetry, they would read poetry, they would read the newspapers.
It sounds quite civilised though, wasn't it a bit rowdy as well at times?
Well, the Cape Club was actually a bit less rowdy than some other Edinburgh clubs at the time, but certainly there was plenty of drink consumed and there are accounts of riotous behaviour, not including Fergusson, but including other members.
Tut tut.
Yes.
And was it a difficult society to gain entry to?
Well, it was a society where you would have to apply for membership and then you would have to be seconded by existing members. And we've got Fergusson's petition for membership here, where he says that he may humbly have the honour of being admitted a member of their society. But if we turn it over, you can see a very rare pencil drawing.
Drawing of Fergusson?
Yep.
You can see the facial resemblance, even in that little sketch there.
Yeah, I think it's probably quite a good likeness.
And what did he get from the Cape Club? I mean, what did it do for him?
Well, the Cape Club was really important for the way that Fergusson worked because I think it probably gave him inspiration, but what it also did was give him a literary network, if you like. So he had all these members of the Cape Club as friends who were important in different ways. So there were publishers, artists, other writers, other poets. It gave him access to lots of different communities in Edinburgh and important people that would help with his career.
The Knights of the Cape Club also get an honourable mention in Auld Reekie.
But Chief o' Cape, we crave thy aid, to get our cares and poortith laid. Sincerity and genius true of knights have ever been the due. Mirth, music, porter deepest dyed, are never here to worth denied. And health, O happiness the Queen, blinks bonny wi' her smile serene.
Beautifully done, Chris.
Thanks very much.
Would performance have been important to the members of the Cape Club?
Oh, absolutely. At that time of night, and I mean, Fergusson was a great performer, and most of these poems in Ferguson's canon were actually published in the Edinburgh magazine, so they would all know them. And he also, I don't think he was a great songwriter from what we know, but he actually did work an early version of the Lyrig, which of course Burns reworked into one of his best-known songs. But Fergusson clearly had a great love of music too, and apparently had a great voice, which of course Burns isn't celebrated for.
We know how much Burns admired Fergusson, but what did he take from him?
Absolutely loads of stuff. I mean, from phrases and imagery and the way of writing Scots. But I mean, when Burns met with Ferguson's poems for the first time, it fired him up. And really, you can see Fergusson shining through all of Burns's Kilmarnock poems. I think David Deitch has said that you'd be there a long time making all the parallels between Fergusson and Burns.
I mean, both in rhyme and rhythm and theme, you sometimes see direct, almost lifts.
Oh, you do?
If you look at the opening to Auld Reekie, where Fergusson talks about Coothie Cheels at evening meat, and there at the very open of Burns's masterpiece, Tam O'Shanter, you've got Druthie Neebers meat. It's amazing that. Do you think that one of the things that Burns got from Fergusson was, if you like, confidence to think like a Scottish poet in his native tongue?
I think it was. I mean, Ramsay before Fergusson and various other Scots poets going back into the mists of time, you know, had used old Scots. But here was somebody who was writing fantastic Scots in the way that Burns had heard it spoken in the street. And here was someone celebrated in the Edinburgh magazine and in books in his language.
While Fergusson was enjoying the bright lights of Edinburgh and becoming one of them, Burns was a 13-year-old boy studying at home and labouring in his father's farm in rural Ayrshire. Burns wouldn't come across printed versions of Ferguson's work until much later. Ferguson's poems were regularly published in Runciman's weekly magazine. Then, In January 1773, when Fergusson was only 22 years old, Runciman's brought out a small book of his poetry. So this is it, the first edition of Fergusson's poems, written in Scots and in English. It was given as a presentation copy to his friend Gavin Wilson, who was also a member of the Cape Club. It contains a very elaborate inscription in verse written by Fergusson and also a flourishing signature at the end. It's a very delicate and beautiful thing. The first edition of Fergusson's poems sold for 2 shillings and 6pence. He made £50, and that counts as quite a success in 1773. Robert Burns, when still a young apprentice poet himself, possessed his own copy of Fergusson's poems, and Burns wrote in that copy, "O thou, my elder brother in misfortune, by far my elder brother in the muse." Fergusson had grown as a poet. He'd gone from being a gifted unknown to being an adornment of the Edinburgh literati. He even had his portrait painted. But it's not to be seen alongside the great and the good when you visit the Scottish National Portrait Gallery. This portrait of Robert Fergusson was painted by his friend Alexander Runciman. He looks very young in the picture, doe-eyed and vulnerable. The portrait doesn't hang on the walls of the gallery, but is overlooked. It lives in the stores, lives in the dark, a bit like Fergusson himself. During the winter of 1773, everything changed. His regular poems in the weekly magazines stopped. He was absent from social life. The storm clouds were gathering in his mind, and he withdrew completely. The poet was suffering some sort of mental breakdown. Unable to sleep, he stopped writing and burned his manuscripts. The only thing he would read was the Bible, and his mind was clouded with thoughts of religion and mortality. Though joy mayst pert Aldrickie owns, eft soon she kens sad sorrow frowns. What group is yon, sae dismal, grim, wi' horrid aspect, cleed and dim? Says death, they're mine, a dowie crew. To me they'll quickly pay their last adieu. After some months, Fergusson appeared to recover, and he took up an invitation to meet up with old friends. But on the way home, he tripped and fell down a flight of stairs. He was carried home and found to be in a state of total insensibility. Violent and raving, he was removed from his home and committed to Darien House, the city's mental asylum. The building stood here. The Bedlam Madhouse was attached to the Edinburgh Poorhouse, and conditions there were notoriously bad.
The Bedlam in Edinburgh was in fact a prison where they were sequestered, and of course that is what happened to Robert Fergusson. The treatment of mental illness in the 18th century was rudimentary, if that. There were no recognized treatment plans of any sort for the 3 major conditions of psychiatry: schizophrenia, manic depressive psychosis, and endogenous depression.
In your opinion, was the diagnosis of insanity correct?
Probably, but there was a complicating factor. We think that Fergusson had a bipolar disorder. That is, he was a cyclothymic. He could be up and down.
Like so many poets.
Like so many poets. But this was then compounded by this fall, because the great change in his condition after the head injury makes many of us think that he in fact had a subdural hematoma.
So bleeding in the skull?
Bleeding outside the brain and pressing on it. It's a very common cause of misdiagnosis of insanity in the 18th century.
Fergusson occupied a damp cell with a straw bed on a stone floor. Friends and family came to visit him and were shocked by what they saw. Then, on the 17th of October, 1774, Fergusson died. He was 24 years old. In his short life, Fergusson produced all his work during a few brief years and published one slim volume of poems. His enduring legacy is his great warmth, humanity, the brilliance of his satire, covering such a range of human emotions and experience, but keeping it local and written in Scots. Yet, despite his Edinburgh success, his work was in danger of descending into oblivion. Then, 12 years after his death, Burns made his pilgrimage to the Canongate churchyard. The early death of his older brother in the Mews haunted Burns throughout his life and led him to take steps to immortalise Fergusson's name. He wrote a letter to the managers of this churchyard. "I'm sorry to be told," he writes, "that the remains of Robert Fergusson lie in your churchyard among the ignoble dead, unnoticed and unknown." Burns asked for permission to lay a commemorative stone on Fergusson's grave. The managers agreed and the stone was commissioned. This was Burns declaring the enormous influence Fergusson had on him. It was a tribute he could scarcely afford. It took Burns 5 years to pay the bill. He wrote the inscription: "No sculptured marble here, nor pompous lay, no storied urn, nor animated bust. This simple stone directs pale Scotia's way to pour her sorrows o'er her poet's dust." 100 years later, fellow Edinburgh writer Robert Louis Stevenson also felt that bond with Fergusson, writing, "You will never know, nor will any man, how deep this feeling is. I believe Fergusson lives in me." Stevenson intended to renovate the grave, but died before he could do so. Since then, generations of Scottish writers have paid their tributes to Fergusson. But it was Burns whom Fergusson taught to use his own voice, in Scots, taught him that truth can lie on your own turf, in your own heart. Burns would have loved the statue of Fergusson that now appears to stride away from the graveyard, away from death, into eternity. Had it not been for the heartfelt intervention of Robert Burns, the genius poetry of Robert Fergusson might have been lost and forgotten. By the same token, if it hadn't been for Robert Fergusson, we might never have had our national bard, Robert Burns.
Riki, farewell. I ne'er could part with thee, but with a dowie heart.
After frae the fife and coast I've seen, the towering on the summit green.
So glower the saints when first is given a favourite keek o' glory and heaven.
On earth nae mair they bend their een, but quick assume angelic mien.
So I on to Fife wad glower no more, but gallop to Edina's shore.